making this. Come check out the video how I made both of these pieces. Both of the pieces that you just saw started out from a single slab of burled elm. I started out by using the track saw to cut a reference edge to make sure I had a square edge to be able to reference off of, hence the name. From there, I ended up cutting off one end to make sure I had a perfect 90 degree. Then I knew, measuring from there, everything would be square, everything would be the exact length I needed. I recently picked up this Festool MFT table, and I'm not going to lie, this thing is a game changer. It makes sure that everything is square, everything is super easy to reference off of. It makes working on a job site or in your shop that much easier. So once again, take things over to the joiner, make sure everything is square, have a reference edge to go off of, rinse and repeat. From there I went over to the table saw, made sure everything was cut to final width. I ended up having to do the same thing with the slab. Some parts of it were just over 20 inches wide, and my planer is 20 inches, and rather than having the hand plane, I figured the customer could live with some small edges being cut off, bringing it down to size, making things more efficient. A lot of people will tell you need to have some sort of a sled underneath something that isn't totally square if you're trying to skip plane it. I tend to go with the method of get the worst side kind of trued up, use that then as a reference side, and you're cutting off the least amount of material then. Being that this was an outdoor table, I knew it didn't have to be absolutely perfectly square, but I did want it to have at least one totally flat edge. So I made sure one side was totally good, the other side had a little bit more pitting. Did the same thing for this cutoff that ended up being the top of the cabinet. As you can see, the grain after coming out of that planer just absolutely pops on this burled elm. Then it was time for everyone's favorite debate, chamfer or roundover. I'm in the chamfer camp. How about you guys? Are you more of a roundover person or are you more of a chamfer person? Then every woodworker's favorite hobby, sanding. This initial sanding was just to get off any of the weird edges, little scraps that may have been coming off. But in all honesty, it only went up to about 100 grit, just to make it prepped and ready for the next step. I used to clean up the edges of slabs by hand, and then I saw a John Malecki video about using a nylon wheel. This thing is an absolute game changer, and I know I say that a lot about certain tools, but this literally took my prep time down from hours to just minutes. You can see on both pieces of this slab, whether it was for this cabinet build or for this outdoor table, this is actually the softer of the two nylon brushes that I have, but it attaches to the drill and makes short work of anything. It still leaves that live edge there intact, but it just takes off any of that remaining bark, wood, or the strains that may have been on there, so it preps it perfectly for a finished product. Speaking of finished products, this was actually my first time using anything from Total Boat. The first product I'm putting on here is Total Boat's Deep Penetrating Epoxy, and although a lot of sexual references could be made, this stuff was absolutely a dream to work with. I found more than anything else, it came out a consistency similar to like a simple syrup. It was just slightly thicker than water, and it seeps down into all the cracks and crevices and pores on the wood, and really seals up everything on a much deeper level. This is definitely something I can recommend for anybody who's going to be doing more of an outdoor piece. But look at the finish that it left. It's a matte finish. It seeped down in. You could still feel all the pores, but it made everything pop. It was absolutely amazing. After that, it was time to start coming in and filling some of the cracks after I knew I had the deep penetrating epoxy down in there. So I actually used CA glue. Now there's two schools of thought. As you can see here, I was putting down the CA glue and then using the accelerator. And truthfully, this is the method I tend to go with most of the time. The other school of thought is using the accelerator first and then putting in the CA glue, so that it essentially, as soon as the CA glue touches it onto the piece, it starts to solidify and you know that it's going to cure up that much faster. I didn't find a drastic difference in the speed of curing. Overall, they did about the same thing, but I was happy with the finish. Within a minute or two, I was able to come back with a chisel, take off the extra, and then I was able to come back and sand it. This is sanding the underside of the piece after 2 days of curing time. There was very little spillover. It made it super easy to just clean it all up. While I was waiting for the final cure time, I actually found time in my schedule to then start cutting down the body of the cabinet. First, I ran everything through the table saw, starting with the full sheet to the rough widths I was going to need. Then I went over to the Festool MFT table, put everything down so I knew I was going to have a perfectly 90-degree cut. Starting out with the two sides, got to make sure obviously the track saw is at the right depth. Then I cut the three interior pieces. Uno, dos, dos, y tres. Then it was time for the back. And that was all the cutting. Now I wanted to make sure everything was laid out as easily as possible. My goal was to build this in under an hour. So after cutting everything down on the table saw, I decided it was time to then start laying everything out. These pieces are actually going to be the runners for the drawers. I decided to just use some scrap Ipe I had from a prior build. I ended up cutting these to a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch squares and simply rounding over the edges of them. From there it was time to cut the drawer slots, so I decided to just lay it out on the table saw, use the dado stack. That way I knew both pieces were going to be exactly square. Wouldn't have to worry about any alignment issues. Then it was time to jump on the domino. I've learned recently to be able to use the edge guides that are on the domino to make sure that everything lines up as easily as possible, but it also makes that assembly so much faster.
On the faceplate, to know that you hit, well, first of all, make sure it's the right
depth, otherwise you'll go through the plywood. Either way, it's super easy to line up once you have those reference lines if you know what you're looking for. From the side of the domino, it was easy to make sure that all the edges aligned, and I just had to line up the bottom. Overall, the total assembly of this cabinet I did in about 45 minutes. The benefit of using some of the edge reference guides from the domino is you don't actually have to do any measuring as long as you know where your reference lines are. So if you lay everything out correctly, your assembly actually goes pretty quick if you know all your pieces are uniform. So as you can see here, I inserted the slots, or the dominoes into the slots. Then I was able to come back, insert the 3 stages of the pieces. There goes the top. And wham bam, thank you ma'am, we got us a cabinet. I figured the customer may want to pretty it up a little bit, so I decided to put a little bit of edge banding just on the show faces that we're going to be facing out. All I did was use some oak banding that I've gotten at your big box store. It's a simple finish. Here I'm actually using a natural finish pencil, carpenter's pencil, to make sure everything is evenly distributed as far as the glue. And from there, it's just edge trimming. Super easy. I don't think you can actually call yourself a YouTube woodworker unless you have one of these. So had to throw in some pocket holes in here to make sure that I could appease all the YouTube gods. I don't know if you make your donations directly to YouTube or if you have to make them over to Craig, but just let me know where I should send my money. Start to finish on this entire build of this cabinet, as I'm sanding here, I remember actually listening to 2.5 innings of a Cubs game. And the only reason I remember that is because it was on in the background as I was assembling all this and I was listening to the video. But it made me realize that a lot of times I overthink a cabinet. I overthink the planning of it. There's a lot of easier ways to work smarter and not harder. Lord knows I overcomplicate far too many things in my life, so if I can make life easier on some cabinet builds, why not? For anybody who's interested, the Cubs were playing the Brewers that day. They ended up losing 8-0. Was it worth me listening to? More than likely not, but it did pass the time at the shop. And just like that, the cabinet's assembled. Now it's time to start working on the drawer. The customer had told me to make this a simple cabinet. They just wanted to be able to use that 16-inch cutoff from the slab, so they were just trying to find a way to use it, and they were originally going to use this in their basement. So I decided to make the entire table out of wood, hence the wooden runners. Being that everything was a uniform width, it made it super easy to just cut it all to a final length based on a style or a rail on the drawer. The only thing I had left to do was cut the slot for the insert bottom. I'm just going to use a 1/4 inch piece of plywood for that. So I just did 2 passes using the table saw and the standard blade. No reason to get fancy here. You'll see here I'm using my finest piece of 1/4 inch plywood. Obviously I've had to make sure that I was going to use nothing but the premier caliber of product for a simple cabinet build. Now the one thing I did do wrong on this is I went quickly and I thought, hey, as long as everything lines up, it's going to be square. You'll note I don't reference here anywhere that there was actually a square face. and I glued and screwed everything after putting some brad nails in. I thought I was good to go. I did the layout on the drawer rails to make sure I had exactly where I needed to put in the screws. Made sure to countersink where the screws were going to go. I installed the drawer rails, put the drawer in. From the front, it looks fantastic. Then you get a little bit closer, and it's less fantastic. As you can see, one side is square in the frame, the other side is not, because I didn't square up the drawer when I assembled it. So I actually had to pull it all apart, make a new drawer. But got that all squared away. Then it was time to put that same chamfer on the top of the cabinet, come back and sand it all up to 320 grit, and prep it for final stain. Now, to make sure I did the stain at the same time for both the cabinet as well as the outdoor table, I wanted to pre-do all the joinery on the underside of the outdoor table for the legs. So here it is, just laying out some pieces, and all I did was square up how far I wanted them in, made sure that everything was going to lay out correctly, and then I started laying out the joinery. All I was going to do was countersink these guys. So I started out by using the marking knife, making sure I squared it up against the back. Once I set those edges, I then referenced off the side, which I knew obviously was 90 degrees as well. And then I was ready to start cutting everything out. On my router, I actually pulled out my slab flattening bit. Was this the correct bit to use? I don't know, but it sure made short work of this project. All I had to do was pretend I was in kindergarten and just stay in the lines when I'm coloring. Then I set a reference edge with a straight edge, came back, straightened everything out. I did this on both sides, of course, because nobody wants to have just one side straightened out. And you're not going to believe it, but I rinsed and repeated the same process for the other leg. I know, wild. But this time, I started with the straight reference fence. And then I went deeper. And then it was the same. Told you it was more the same. I set the reference side on this edge. And once I get this straight reference piece, I end up hogging out the material in the middle. I told you I was going to hog out the middle. Kind of like I've seen this footage a bunch of times. Or I have some sort of magic crystal ball, which could also be fun. But it's not what I have. Then I came back with a chisel. Time to square up those corners, make them look nice and fancy. Now there is a little bit of a visual trick here. It does look like I'm not really cutting anything away because there's still that color difference. It's mostly because the slab flattening bit kind of burned the wood a little bit, and where I'm cutting out didn't get that effect. So the same line is still there, but it is flushed out. Then I went and did it on the other side, repeated the process on all four of the corners for each of these feet. That corner was unfortunately so close to the edge that it was basically blown out just by using the router. So rather than having something tear out with the customer, I decided to just cut out that edge on my own. Next, it was time to mark out where I was going to do the drilling for the final bolt placements. I initially came in with this self-centering bit. Then I removed that piece and followed up with the ample size drill bit to make sure that there wasn't a bunch of tear out. I repeated the process of putting the table leg back in. Then it was time to follow up with the final bolts. Now the benefit of these table bases is you can see the slots are a little larger, so they actually allow for seasonal wood movement on their own, and I didn't have to do any extra drilling. So at that point it was time to take it off the bench and get it ready for final prep. And final prep meant taking off the legs that I had just put on, putting a blanket down, and obviously then doing our final sanding. So got this up to about 320 grit across the board, and I actually started out with the Total Boat Halcyon on the bottom of this piece. Being that I had never worked with it before, I wanted to see what the reaction was going to be. This stuff was an absolute dream. It essentially goes on like a polyurethane, but it is a marine grade, so I wanted to make sure the bottom was going to be protected. I ended up putting 4 coats on the bottom here, and I ended up putting about 6 coats on the top, but I only used this 1 quart for both the cabinet top as well as the outdoor bench top. And as you can see, it makes the grain pop. It looks absolutely astounding, and it protects it on top of that. Following up on the top side, putting the Halcyon on top of that was super easy. Being that it already had the deep penetrating epoxy soaked in, this essentially made it almost a semi-gloss finish to it. To me, this was a perfect finish for this piece. As I said, I ended up putting about 6 coats on there, so I know it's totally protected. It's going to withstand any kind of weather conditions. And the customers even told me that they're going to bring it in during the winter, so I'm not worried. But the benefit of this is, if need be, I can come back and finish it another time. Now, as you can see for the cabinet top, this did not have the deep penetrating epoxy, so it's a little bit lighter toned, but the Halcyon did exactly what I thought it would do by enhancing some of the color and enhancing some of the grain, and you can see the side-by-side comparison. The bench top here had the penetrating epoxy initially, so it is a little bit darker and the grain pops a little more. Just for uniformity's sake, if these were going to be side-by-side, I would definitely follow up with the penetrating epoxy on top before I did the Halcyon. But being that these are going to be one outside, one inside, I wasn't as concerned about that. And with all the coats of finish on there, now it's time to reassemble everything and get it ready for delivery. So starting out with the legs on the outdoor bench, coming back with the same bolts that I'd used before, everything was pre-slotted, pre-threaded. It was super easy to put together. If you guys have enjoyed watching this build, obviously feel free to check out some of the other videos. If you want to see other videos as they come out, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You'll see them as they're coming out. I'm trying to get these out much more regularly. Nothing like precariously balancing a finished piece of furniture as you manhandle it down yourself. But there we go. Finished outdoor table. And that grain does look super sexy, if I do say so myself. Then it was time to do the final assembly on the cabinet. So literally just attaching the base to the top. Per usual, I drastically over-engineered this and used far too many screws to do so, but don't want it to come apart. And as you'll see, I ended up using a piece of maple as the drawer front, more so because it's what I had available, but I wanted to draw a little bit of attention to both that as well as the top. I wanted those to be the focal point rather than the base of the cabinet. So here they are together. The initial slab cut into 2 pieces, split between 2 separate projects. Same customer. I'm really happy with how these turned out. I couldn't have been more happy using the Total Boat products, and I cannot recommend them enough moving forward. For anybody who has any questions about it, feel free to reach out. If not, reach out to your local Total Boat rep. Here's a picture of the table in its final resting place at the customer's house. Once again, if you guys enjoyed, feel free to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys soon. Thank you for tuning in.